On a muggy Saturday night on June 7, 1986, 29-year-old Kathy Lipscomb parked her car in front of an apartment complex in San Antonio, Texas, and reached into her purse for a tube of lipstick. Kathy tilted the rearview mirror toward her face and touched up her lips. And as she looked at her reflection and swept her platinum bangs to the side of her forehead, she almost didn't recognize herself. There was a glow on her face that she hadn't seen in a long time, not since she'd been a newlywed. These days, the happy parts of Kathy's marriage felt very far in the past. Over the last 8 years, she and her husband had had 2 children, who they both loved deeply. But Kathy had come to feel increasingly trapped in her life, until just about a month ago when she and her husband had finally agreed to separate. To Kathy, that decision felt like it gave her back her freedom, and she knew that who she was seeing now in the rearview mirror of her brand new car was a brand new woman. Kathy grabbed her purse from the passenger seat, got out of the car, and walked towards the large apartment building up ahead. And suddenly, she felt really nervous. But it was the good kind of nervous. She had butterflies in her stomach because she was on the way to spend the night with her new boyfriend, who she had fallen completely in love with. Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband had the kids, and for at least a little while, Kathy could put all her worries out of her mind. So she walked up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor of the building and then rang the doorbell of her boyfriend's apartment. Kathy heard footsteps drawing closer, and then the door opened up, and Kathy beamed at the man standing there. The man grabbed Kathy and kissed her, led her inside, and shut the door behind them. The next evening, Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, 30-year-old Air Force Master Sergeant Bill Lipscomb, buckled their 4-year-old son and 7-year-old daughter into the backseat of his car and began driving to the other side of town, where Kathy had just moved into her own apartment. Kathy was supposed to pick the kids up from Bill's house, but she hadn't shown up and she wasn't answering her phone. So now, Bill was driving the kids to her. When they got to Kathy's building, Bill knocked on the front door of Kathy's unit, which was on the ground floor, and he and the kids waited there in silence. When she didn't answer the door, Bill knocked again. But still, there was no answer. He turned to his kids and tried to smile because he didn't want to upset them, but he knew this was actually really weird. Kathy was never even late picking up their kids, so the idea that she just would blow it off entirely and then also not be home made no sense. Bill told the kids to wait at the door, and then he walked back to his car. He got a notepad, a pen, and a roll of tape out of the glove box and walked back to the building. Bill wrote a note stating that he and the kids were there at 6:45 and would try again later. Then he stuck that note to Kathy's front door. Then he looked down at the kids and asked them if they wanted to write their mom a note too. The little girl nodded and took the pen from her dad and scribbled onto the pad, and Bill tore out the page and stuck that to the door as well. The note read in large block letters, "Mommy, we love you." A day later, at around 9:30 a.m. on Monday morning, a woman working at a university health clinic named Sarah Bowers had a question for Kathy Lipscomb, who was one of the nurses that she worked with. So Sarah walked over to Kathy's office. But when she stepped inside, it was empty, and Sarah saw that a bunch of pink "while you were out" memos had piled up on Kathy's desk. Sarah walked in and picked up one of the messages and read it. It was from Kathy's husband, Bill. He had called in an hour earlier looking for his wife. And this, coupled with the stack of other notes that were very similar, gave Sarah a bad feeling in the pit of her stomach. Because Kathy was one of the most reliable nurses in the clinic. Like, where had she gone? Why hadn't she called in? Sarah picked up the phone and dialed Kathy's apartment number. She knew it because she and Kathy were actually friends outside of work. But the call just rang without an answer, and Sarah eventually hung up and returned to her desk. But over the next hour, Sarah could barely focus because all she could think about was Kathy. She kept looking up at the clock on the wall, watching the minutes tick by, hoping to see her friend walk into the office with a totally reasonable explanation for why she was late. Or even without an explanation. It didn't matter, so long as Sarah knew Kathy was okay. By the time the clock struck 10 that morning and Kathy still had not shown up to work, Sarah could not stand it any longer. She got up and walked directly to the office of her and Kathy's boss, Dr. David Pearl. When Dr. Pearl saw Sarah standing at his door with a troubled look on her face, he asked her what was wrong. Sarah told him that Kathy was 2 hours late to work, and she was not answering her phone. And based on the notes on her desk that were piling up, her husband had also not heard from her either. At this, Dr. Pearl furrowed his brow. Kathy hadn't mentioned anything to him about being late or absent that day, It made him concerned that she might be sick or maybe even injured and couldn't get to the phone. So he asked Sarah to drive over to Kathy's apartment to check on her. Sarah sped over to Kathy's apartment, which was only about 10 minutes away. When she got there, she found the notes on the door and she knocked, but there was no answer. And so feeling kind of desperate, she ran to get the building manager and begged the woman to let her into her friend's apartment. Now, the manager knew this was against company policy to do this, but she could see how upset Sarah was, so she unlocked Kathy's door and let Sarah go inside. And what Sarah found inside sent her panic through the roof. The apartment was perfectly neat and tidy. It didn't look like anything bad had happened here, but there was no sign of Kathy. In fact, it looked like she had not been home for days. At around the same time, about 15 miles away, an airman who worked at the local Air Force Base was driving to work down a 2-lane road outside of town when he noticed something lying in the grass on the side of the road. The airman pulled over to the shoulder and got out of his car to investigate. He walked off the road and into the grass and stared down into the weeds in utter disbelief. When he got over the initial shock, he ran back to his car, drove to the nearest house, and called the police. It took police officers from the Bexar County Sheriff's Office just a few minutes to arrive at the spot on the road where the airman had made his discovery. It was a strange location for a 911 call. The area was pretty much deserted, and this road was basically only used by Air Force personnel who drove in and out of the base. The police got out of their cruiser and walked to the side of the road into some spiky grass, and just a few feet in, they stopped. For a minute, they just stood there together in silence, looking down. Because there, lying in the weeds below, they saw the dead body of what looked like a teenage girl. She was naked and covered with ants, and they saw thin trails of blood on the sides of her mouth. But as horrifying as all of that was, the officers were actually much more fixated on something else. The girl's body was contorted. Her legs were bent at the knee, and her ankles were crossed, as if she had been sitting crisscross style. Her torso had been folded forward, so her chest was resting on her legs, and there was some kind of fabric under her foot. The officers had been to enough crime scenes to know that this girl's body had not just been tossed out of a car quickly by a person trying to get rid of evidence. Instead, her body had been carefully posed, like whoever killed her wanted her to be found. That afternoon, homicide investigator Sergeant Sal Marin sat in his office at the sheriff's station trying to ID the victim that police had just found on the side of the road. Marin had started off pretty confident that he would be able to figure out who it was pretty quickly. From the looks of things, the victim appeared to be a teenager, and she had been healthy, well cared for, and well groomed. In other words, she looked like she probably had a family who would definitely report her missing right away. But so far, Marin had not been able to find any missing persons reports that matched her description, and he thought that was strange. Just then, a secretary came by and dropped off the medical examiner's report from the autopsy along with the crime scene report. Marin grabbed the medical examiner's report first, and as soon as he opened it, he grimaced. The victim had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death, most likely on Sunday night, so one day before she was found. Her body appeared to have been posed soon after her death, before rigor mortis had set in, which is the stiffening of the body after death. And to Marin, this felt off. Usually, when young women were murdered, the killer was someone they knew, either a partner, friend, or a family member who acted out of rage or jealousy. Sadly, it wasn't unusual to see sexual assault or strangulation in cases like this, but it was extremely unusual to see such deliberate posing of the body. Killers who know their victims often try to cover them up, not display them. Posing a body was evidence of a careful and deliberate killer, acting with a plan. It was something that sadists and serial killers did, and it made Marin think that his killer was likely a stranger to the victim. And that was bad news, because killings by strangers were among the hardest to solve. The suspect pool was enormous, because the killer could be anyone. But as Marin continued through the report, he spotted what he thought might be his first clue. 4 strands of long red hair that were found on the girl's body. The girl was a blonde, which meant the red hairs could have come from her killer. The medical examiner had examined these hairs under a microscope, and they found they had been dyed red and they had no roots. And Marin wasn't sure what to make of this. The hair could be from a wig, or they could be from a woman's head, but Marin found it highly unlikely that his killer was female. He put the autopsy report down and picked up the crime scene report. And here, Marin found his second clue. The victim's clothing, which was a pair of Levi's jeans and a t-shirt, had been placed underneath her right foot by the killer. And what Marin noticed was the clothing had been rolled up rather than folded. Marin picked up a pen and wrote down the word military in the margins. Marin knew that people in the military were trained to roll up their clothes instead of folding them, because it was more compact and efficient. And the girl's body had been found on a road used almost exclusively by members of the Air Force. But before Marin got too deep into his theories on the killer, his first priority was to find the dead girl's identity. Only then would he be able to begin retracing her last moments and figuring out who she had contact with in her final days. So, over the next hour, he began reaching out to local radio and TV stations, asking producers to broadcast news of the crime every half hour, with a description of the young victim. He got the story placement at the top of the afternoon news. Later, at 5 p.m., when still no tips had come in, Marin was getting ready to leave and grab something to eat, but just as he was standing up from his desk, his office door swung open and a deputy handed him a single piece of paper. It was a missing persons report for a woman named Kathy Lipscomb. Her family had just called to report that no one had seen or heard from her since Saturday. And the second Marin started reading the report, he felt a rush of adrenaline. Kathy was petite, blonde, and had gone missing right around the time the medical examiner believed his victim had been killed. Marin thought Kathy might be his victim. But then his eyes settled on Kathy's age, and he felt his excitement drain away. Kathy was 29 years old, almost 30, but the dead woman found on the side of the road looked a full decade younger than that, at least, so Kathy didn't seem to be a match for his homicide victim. Still, Marin wondered if this missing persons report about Kathy Lipscomb was a different kind of clue in his case, because based on Kathy's physical description, it was eerie how similar the two women were. Marin felt his appetite vanish, and he sat back down at his desk. He was starting to fear that he could have a serial killer on his hands, who was hunting petite blonde women, and that Kathy could actually be his second victim. A few hours later, Sergeant Marin's efforts to get the description of his victim blasted out onto the airwaves paid off. By this point, Marin was at home on his couch watching TV when his phone rang. He walked into the kitchen and picked it up. It was the medical examiner's office calling to tell him that a woman watching the news had heard about the discovery of the body and realized that the description of the young victim matched a friend of hers perfectly. At first, this woman had not wanted to believe it, so she actually had gone to her friend's apartment to check on her. But when her friend did not answer the door, the woman had called the police, and the police directed this woman to the medical examiner's office where she would positively identify the body. Marin's victim finally had a name. When Marin heard the name, he immediately turned to the coffee maker on his counter and started brewing a pot. He was going to have to go straight back to work. Because Marin did not have two victims on his hands, he had just one. The dead body of the girl by the side of the road and the missing Kathy Lipscomb were one and the same. Kathy, despite being 29 years old, was just unusually young-looking. This meant that Marin's theory of the case, that he might be dealing with a serial killer, had become a bit more unlikely. He still viewed the posing of the body as evidence that the killer was a stranger to the victim, acting on a calculated plan rather than a sudden burst of emotion. But he was down to just one victim. And now that his victim did have an identity, Marin had to do the part of his job that he hated the most, and that was to tell his victim's family about the murder. About an hour later, Marin met Kathy's husband, Bill Lipscomb, at the sheriff's station. Marin was aware that Bill was a decorated member of the Air Force, and that he was very young to be a master sergeant, which was a pretty high rank. So Marin knew that the smartest way to approach Bill was to be formal and polite, rather than aggressive, even though divorce was a classic motive for murder, and Bill was a natural suspect. So, in the interview room, Marin reached out and shook Bill's hand and told him he was very sorry about his wife. He promised to do everything he could to bring her killer to justice. But while Marin was giving Bill his condolences, he was also looking Bill over very carefully, visually checking his arms, his hands, and his face for any signs of injury, like bruises, scratches, or fingernail marks that might be evidence of a recent struggle. But, except for the fact that Bill was pale and sweating, he appeared to be physically unharmed. Marin opened up his notepad and asked Bill where he was over the weekend when Kathy had gone missing. Bill said he had been with his and Kathy's children since Friday afternoon. He said they didn't do much, just kind of hung around the house. Bill said Marin could talk to the kids, and they would tell him the same thing. Marin nodded and then asked Bill how long Kathy had been living in her new apartment. When Bill sighed at the question, Marin looked up from his pad. He was surprised to see that Bill almost looked angry. Bill shook his head and told Marin that Kathy had only been in the new place for about a week or so, but the neighborhood it was in had been a point of contention between them. He said he'd warned Kathy it was a bad area. He didn't like the seedy bars and strip joints all over the place, but Kathy had refused to listen to him. The apartment was close to her work, and she told him it was not his business anyway. Bill shook his head again and looked down at the table, and Marin could tell that clearly the separation between Bill and Kathy was still pretty raw. He told Bill he had just one more question, and then he'd let Bill go home to his kids. Marin explained to Bill that based on the location where Kathy's body was found, and the way her clothes were rolled up, not folded, he thought there could be a military connection. He asked Bill if any of his fellow airmen might have had a problem with Kathy, or if one of Bill's subordinates could have been angry at him. And with this question, Bill went from looking upset at Kathy to looking upset at Marin. He said no, absolutely not. His friends at the Air Force all loved Kathy, and he got along great with the people he worked with, regardless of rank. He didn't have any enemies, and no one he knew could have done anything like this. Marin sat back studying Bill. He could tell Bill was worn out and getting frustrated, but he didn't find that particularly suspicious, given the circumstances. Marin decided that the best move was just to tell Bill to go home. It was late, and he'd get better interviews in the morning. The next morning, Sergeant Marin interviewed Bill and Kathy's two young kids, and they confirmed their father's story. They had been with their dad all weekend, just like he'd said. So Marin decided he had to start from square one. First, he decided to interview Kathy's neighbors to see if anyone had spotted a person lurking outside her apartment. If the killer was a stranger to Kathy, like Marin suspected, then they would likely have found her by simply running into her somewhere, and it was possible they might have followed her home. And right away, when he started to canvass, he got a tip and a surprise. Because one of Kathy's neighbors told him that on the day Kathy's body was found, he saw a suspicious person walk up to Kathy's door and then just lurk there for a few minutes before walking away. And the neighbor said this person was a woman, not a man, which was not what Marin was expecting. When he asked the neighbor for a physical description of this woman, the neighbor paused and thought for a second, saying he hadn't gotten a very good look. But then his eyes lit up as he remembered one crucial detail. The suspicious woman had long, red hair, just like the 4 strands of long red hair the medical examiner had found on the victim's body. Sergeant Marin spent the next couple of days talking to Kathy's family, friends, and coworkers, probing for any information about a red-haired woman in Kathy's orbit. But not one single person had any idea who that could be. Instead, Kathy's friends and family had a different idea for a suspect: Kathy's new boyfriend. Kathy had only been dating this man for a few weeks, but she was already saying she was madly in love with him. But some of her friends thought the boyfriend was bad news. The first reason for this was because he was married. The boyfriend kept telling Kathy that he and his wife were separating and would be divorced soon, and although Kathy believed him, none of her friends did. This boyfriend also had a reputation for sleeping around and promising every woman he was with that he was going to leave his wife for them. In fact, he was known for keeping a bachelor pad apartment where he could entertain his various girlfriends without his wife's knowledge. And another reason Kathy's friends didn't like her boyfriend was even simpler. It was because he was her boss. Kathy's boyfriend's name was Dr. David Pearl. It was Dr. Pearl who, on the Monday that Kathy failed to show up for work, sent her coworker Sarah to Kathy's house to check on her. Kathy's friends knew she had been spending time with Dr. Pearl when she didn't have the kids with her, and that caught Marin's attention, because the kids had been with their father on Saturday night, which, as far as police knew, was the last time anyone had seen Kathy alive. Marin wanted to know if Kathy had gone to meet Dr. Pearl that night. And so, a few days into his investigation, Marin found himself putting the red-haired woman on the back burner for a new number one suspect, Kathy's boss and boyfriend, Dr. Pearl. Almost a week after Kathy was murdered, Marin sat at his desk in police headquarters, making a list of possible scenarios while he waited for uniformed officers to bring Dr. Pearl in to be interviewed. He thought maybe Kathy had been pushing Dr. Pearl to get a divorce. Maybe Kathy threatened to tell his wife. Or maybe, Marin thought, the doctor's wife had already found out about the affair and taken revenge on Kathy. Marin sat back at his desk and wondered if the suspicious red-haired woman who had been seen at Kathy's apartment the day her body was found could be Dr. Pearl's wife. Just then, a uniformed officer knocked on Marin's door to tell him that Dr. Pearl was waiting for him. Marin stood up and followed the officer back to the little interview room where Dr. Pearl was sitting, looking perfectly calm and in control. When Marin walked in, Dr. Pearl immediately reached out and shook his hand. And then before Marin could ask even one question, the doctor began telling him how shocked he was by Kathy's death. The doctor said it just didn't make any sense, because he had just seen Kathy a day or two before she died, and she had seemed totally fine. Marin nodded, being careful to keep his facial expression neutral. When Dr. Pearl was done saying how sorry he was for Kathy, Marin looked down at his pad and asked, in a very deliberate voice, where and when exactly had the doctor last seen Kathy. And at this, the doctor went silent. Marin knew it was clear from his tone that he already knew where and when Dr. Pearl had last seen Kathy, like he knew about the affair, and it was obvious. But what Marin was doing with this question was testing how this very smooth suspect reacted to a little bit of pressure. Dr. Pearl stared at Marin for a few seconds with a polite but completely blank expression on his face, and after a tense moment, the doctor gave an apologetic smile and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to speak to my lawyer." On Saturday, June 15th, so a week after Kathy had been murdered, Marin was at home, taking a day off to try to clear his head. This case had felt like trying to put together pieces from 3 different puzzles into one coherent picture. None of the clues made sense together. The posing of the body suggested a methodical killer who did not know the victim. But Marin's best suspect was Kathy's boyfriend. The rolled-up clothes suggested the killer had a military background, and Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband was a member of the Air Force. But he had a rock-solid alibi, and none of his friends or colleagues had any real link to Kathy. The sexual assault suggested that the killer was a man, but the long red hairs on the body and the suspicious red-haired woman at Kathy's door were evidence that there was a female involved. And beyond all these contradictions, there was very little in the way of actual physical evidence to tie any suspect at all to the murder scene. So when Dr. Pearl had lawyered up during his interview, Marin had had no choice but to let him walk out of police headquarters without charging him. And since then, the only thing he'd learned was that Dr. Pearl's wife did not have red hair and had never been to Kathy's apartment. Just then, Marin heard his phone ring and he hopped up. He hoped it was someone calling to tell him there had been a new break in the case, just like the last time he got a call at home. But when he answered, it was just more bad news. A crime scene tech told him that Kathy's car had been found in the parking lot of a restaurant a mile from her apartment. Forensic investigators had searched it for fingerprints, but they came up empty. Someone had wiped it clean. Over the next few weeks, every lead Marin tried to chase went nowhere. And slowly, newer homicide cases started to pile up, and they began to take up more and more of Marin's time. Marin did return to Kathy's case every few weeks, hoping he'd spot something he missed. But no matter how many times he read the different reports, nothing in them made any more sense than it had in the beginning. A month or two into the investigation, Kathy's mother had called Marin, and he promised her he would make sure that Kathy's murder was not forgotten. But as the months piled up, the case just got colder. By the 1-year anniversary of Kathy's death, the only thing Marin knew for sure was that whoever killed Kathy had not killed again, at least not in the area of Bexar County. There had been no other murders reported with the posing of the body or the long red hairs or the rolled-up clothing. By the 2-year anniversary of Kathy's death, Marin had begun to dread the calls from Kathy's family, because the only thing he had to offer them were apologies. It was not until late 1988, so more than 2 years after Kathy was murdered, that all the blurry pieces of evidence finally snapped into focus. And it happened because Kathy's family hired a private investigator. When this PI heard about the initial handling of the case and the huge mistake made in thinking that the body of Kathy Lipscomb was that of a teenage girl, he decided to start the investigation all over again. And in doing so, he discovered a critical piece of evidence that somehow the police had missed. That evidence was Kathy's datebook. In this datebook, Kathy had written cryptic notes about something called the WAPS test. The PI didn't know what a WAPS test was, but apparently, someone Kathy knew had all the answers to this test and was passing them around. To the PI, this sounded like Kathy knew something about some kind of cheating scandal. Not like adultery, like actual cheating on a test. But the PI wondered who in Kathy's orbit would be taking a standardized test. It didn't make sense for anyone at Kathy's job, which was at a medical office. On a hunch, the PI called the nearby Air Force Base. And that's when he realized he was holding the link that completed the chain of evidence and broke the case wide open. Now, the PI worked with the Air Force as well as Sergeant Marin to bring in a man who had, until the discovery of the datebook, flown completely under the radar. His name was Clint Richards, and he had worked with Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, Bill Lipscomb, in the Air Force. And when investigators brought Clint in to talk, he told them everything. Based on Clint's story and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kathy Lipscomb on the night of June 8, 1986. That night, the killer sat patiently inside of their home on their couch, waiting for Kathy to arrive. They'd been expecting her. And when the killer heard knocking, they walked across the room, put a smile on their face, and opened their front door. There was Kathy, exactly on time as usual. The killer gestured for her to come inside, and she stepped over the threshold while the killer shut the door behind her. As soon as Kathy looked around the room, she realized something was wrong. It was too quiet. But the killer was expecting this. When Kathy turned to confront them, the killer pushed her to the ground and raped her. Then they grabbed an electrical cord they had hidden nearby, climbed on top of Kathy, and wrapped it around her neck. As they pulled, Kathy tried to fight back, but after several minutes, it was too much and she stopped moving. After Kathy was dead, the killer stood up, crossed the room, and opened a cedar chest. Then they dragged Kathy's limp body across the floor, they folded her at the waist, picked her up, and jammed her inside of the chest, crossing her legs so she'd fit. Once the chest was closed, the killer called a friend. A few hours later, the killer and the friend carried the cedar chest with Kathy's body inside out of the killer's apartment and loaded it into the friend's vehicle. Then, the killer handed the friend 4 strands of long red hair and walked back inside of their house. The friend drove off with Kathy's body and the hair. After a few minutes, the friend turned their car onto a deserted 2-lane road outside of town. They pulled over, removed Kathy's body from the chest, and carefully placed her on the ground on the shoulder of the road. Then, the friend set about staging the scene to look as if the killer had posed Kathy's body on purpose. They rolled up Kathy's clothing and placed it underneath her right foot, and then they laid the 4 long red hairs on top of Kathy's body. Finally, when the scene was perfect, the friend got back into their car and drove home. With Kathy's death, both the killer and the friend were now certain that no one would ever know that the killer had cheated on the promotional exam that the Air Force called the Weighted Airman Promotion Systems Test, or as everybody called it for short, the WAPS test. The friend who dumped the body was Clint Richards, and the killer was Kathy's soon-to-be ex-husband, Bill Lipscomb. It was Bill, the young master sergeant who had moved up the Air Force ranks with shocking speed, who had cheated on the WAPS test. Kathy knew about it, and she had threatened to expose him during their divorce because she wanted Bill to give her full custody of the children. It would turn out that Marin had been correct in his assessment that Kathy's killer had acted with a plan and had deliberately posed her body. But he had been wrong about why. Bill and Clint had worked together to stage the crime scene to make it look like a murder committed by a sadistic rapist. Those long red hairs were part of that staging, meant to throw the police off, and they had worked even better than either Bill or Clint had expected. and this was because of a chain of events that police themselves had set in motion in their early efforts to identify the body found on the side of the road, when they believed the victim was significantly younger than she was. Police had put the description of the victim out to the media, and a friend of Kathy's had heard it. That friend had been the one to make the identification of Kathy's body, but she only did so after going to Kathy's apartment to check on her. The suspicious red-headed woman the neighbor had seen was actually just Kathy's friend. It was a total coincidence, but it had confused investigators for years. Meanwhile, Bill had escaped suspicion with his alibi because he had told his young children to lie to the police about being with him all night. Bill had preemptively suggested to Marin that Marin should talk to his kids because he knew they would lie for him. It was only when the PI began poking around on the case that Bill's 9-year-old daughter finally found the courage to tell the truth. She had not been with her dad the night her mom was killed. Instead, her dad's friend, Clint Richards, had taken her and her brother out for dinner. That was why, when Kathy arrived at Bill's house right on time to pick up her kids like she always was, she found the house too quiet and realized her kids were not there. When Kathy turned around to confront Bill, he raped and killed her. Clint Richards avoided prosecution for cooperating with authorities. As for Bill Lipscomb, he pled guilty to Kathy's murder in order to avoid the death penalty, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. However, he was granted an early release in May of 2021. Around 9 p.m. on Saturday, October 15, 1988, a 33-year-old woman named Cheryl Petrie grabbed a candy bar off the rack inside of PJ's Market. PJ's Market was a little convenience store in the city of Port Orchard, Washington, and it was where Cheryl worked. She was the cashier. And without ringing this candy bar up, Cheryl simply handed it across the counter to a female college student who had just come into the store to talk to Cheryl. This student had temporarily moved right next door to PJ's Market, and the student, after coming into the market and meeting Cheryl, they had immediately taken a liking to her, and so it became kind of like her routine to come into the market basically every night and just sit down and chat with Cheryl, sometimes for hours. The student would talk about their day at school, they'd talk about their personal life, they'd tell Cheryl all of their problems and secrets. I mean, Cheryl really became this student's confidant. And believe it or not, this was an effect that Cheryl had on lots of people. Cheryl was incredibly kind, she was empathetic, she was a great listener, she never acted like she was judging you, and she never gossiped about people. And also Cheryl had a very disarming sense of humor. It was very goofy, she was always cracking up at jokes that she had made, and so people just felt at ease around Cheryl. And they typically left interactions with her in a good mood. And on this night, when the student had come into the market, they had told Cheryl that they actually had found an apartment in Port Orchard that they were going to be moving to, so they were going to be leaving PJ's where they were now. But the student had said that they really had no money, and so it was going to be a challenge to furnish this apartment. Heck, it was going to be a challenge just to buy groceries for this apartment. And when Cheryl heard this, she first congratulated the student, but then also said, well, hey, I'll give you some of my own furniture because I don't need it all, and that will help you furnish the apartment. And then also Cheryl had grabbed that chocolate bar off the rack and given it to the student for free as a sort of like, here's your first grocery as well. The student was totally floored by Cheryl's generosity and tried to tell her, keep your furniture and you can keep this chocolate or I'll pay for it. But Cheryl insisted. She was like, nope, tomorrow I will bring you furniture and please take this candy bar. And so the student finally relented and thanked Cheryl profusely. And really, this behavior was so typical of Cheryl. She was a single mom raising a 9-year-old girl and a baby boy, and so she worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. On the weekends, she worked at PJ's Market, and then during the week, she worked at a Ford car dealership. But despite being totally swamped basically all the time providing for her family, any spare time Cheryl had, she tried to give it to other people. Whether that was helping a coworker with their resume or baking some goodies for a sick friend at church, Cheryl was all about helping other people. The area of Port Orchard where Cheryl lived was only about an hour away from the big city of Seattle, but to Cheryl, this part of Port Orchard felt much farther away than that. She lived in this tiny little blue single-story house that was tucked away in the woods, surrounded by all these tall trees. The road to her house was very rural and winding, and so where she lived felt very isolated. It was a beautiful area, no doubt, but it was also kind of a bad neighborhood. In fact, a man had been shot and killed not far from Cheryl's house just a year earlier. But this home was all she could afford. Basically, Cheryl was poor and had almost nothing of her own. But whatever she did have, she was far more likely to give away than keep for herself. Eventually, Cheryl would tell the college student that she really needed to get back to the other customers and kind of do her job and not just sit here and chat this whole time. And so the student said, thank you again for the candy and for the offer of the free furniture. And then the student left the store, at which point Cheryl reached into her pocket and grabbed some change and dumped it in the register to pay for the candy bar. Even though Cheryl knew she very likely could have gotten away with simply giving out the candy and not paying for it, Cheryl was unfailingly honest, and so she knew she wanted to pay for the candy. Cheryl would man the register until 11 p.m. that night, chatting with many more regulars who came in and out, and then at 11 p.m., Cheryl locked the front door, and then she checked the register to make sure it was all balanced and all the cash was in there, and then by 11:15, she was calling her boss to report that her shift had gone fine and that she was taking off for the night. After Cheryl had left and locked the store behind her, she made her way out to her beat-up silver sedan car that was parked outside, and then she began the drive back home, knowing that she'd be right back to PJ's the very next morning, right when it opened at 7 a.m. At the same time that Cheryl was wrapping up for the night and making her way home, her ex-husband, Roland Pitre, who lived on the other side of town, was very excited. This was the night that Roland was going to win back Cheryl. Roland glanced at his watch and saw it was just past 11 p.m., and so it was almost time. He imagined how happy Cheryl would be when he unveiled his big surprise. She would run to him and he would hold her and tell her how much he loved her and how he had always loved her. Roland hadn't yet figured out how he was going to explain his big plan to win back his ex to his current girlfriend, but he figured he would just work that out later. The most important thing for Roland right now was showing Cheryl how wrong and stupid he had been and how much he needed her and how much she needed him. Also, he knew their kids would be totally thrilled if they got back together. Roland was looking after their son and daughter that weekend, and he had seen firsthand that his daughter was clearly very upset about the fact that her parents were split up. Roland and Cheryl had a very complicated history, but Roland knew, really, their breakup was his fault. They had met about 12 years earlier when Roland had been on leave from the military. At the time, Roland was a Marine sergeant, and he was also a very accomplished judo instructor. He was handsome and charismatic, and he had a charming Creole accent because he had grown up in a Cajun French family near New Orleans. But despite how appealing Roland looked, he actually was kind of a terrible romantic partner. Every woman he had ever been with, he had cheated on and then made up elaborate lies to cover it up. But regardless, Cheryl had fallen head over heels in love with Roland. And part of the reason that happened was because Cheryl was actually pretty insecure. She had long auburn hair and beautiful blue eyes and this amazing personality. But to Cheryl, she felt like she was kind of plain looking, and she also felt like she was kind of chubby, and she got the sense that men kind of did not find her all that attractive. And when she met Roland, she saw right away that the other women he had been with were these overtly glamorous and beautiful women. And so when she noticed Roland taking an interest in her, it was incredible. She felt so lucky. And so Roland and Cheryl had gotten married, they'd had their daughter together, and then basically right away, Roland had begun cheating on Cheryl. They ended up getting divorced 8 years earlier in 1980, and it was right around this point that Roland really just totally blew his life up. The woman Roland was cheating on Cheryl with was also married, and so Roland came up with this plot to murder this woman's husband. And the husband would get murdered, but when Roland was on trial, the prosecutors couldn't really untangle what his actual role was in the murder. It was not clear if he really was the guy who did the killing, or if he simply had kind of come up with the idea and other people had done it. And so ultimately, Roland was found guilty for his role in this murder, but he was only sentenced to 6 years in prison. And strangely enough, it was actually during this time that Roland was in jail that he and Cheryl kind of came back to each other. While Roland was behind bars, he had this epiphany that Cheryl was the best thing that ever happened to him, and he totally screwed it up. And so he began writing her letters, telling her how much he loved her and how sorry he was for being unfaithful. And also he began explaining that, the charges he was found guilty of in connection to this murder were totally not true, that he had been screwed. And Cheryl had eventually begun writing back to Roland, telling him that she still loved him too. And they actually would get remarried while Roland was in prison. And then when he got out of prison, he moved in with Cheryl and their daughter in Port Orchard, and they would have another baby together, their son, and then also Roland enrolled in nursing school. And so for a time, this family was back together and everything was great. But eventually, Roland went back to his old ways and began cheating on Cheryl again, and before long, the couple had separated again and began living separately. And so fast forward back to the night of October 15th, 1988, and Roland is anxiously waiting to begin this big plan to win Cheryl back, and he glances at his watch and he sees it's now 11:30 p.m., which means it's go time. And so Roland, he stands up really quickly and begins walking towards the front door of his house when suddenly he feels so lightheaded that he actually falls back on the couch and passes out cold. Roland had serious blood pressure issues, and sometimes if he stood up too quickly, it would make him feel really dizzy and he would faint, and so that's what happened. And then at some point after he fainted, Roland kind of came to, but he was in such a fog mentally that instead of, going out and doing this big plan to win Cheryl back, he just kind of wandered his way upstairs and climbed in bed with his girlfriend and fell asleep for the rest of the night. Cheryl was due back at PJ's Market the next morning at 7 a.m. She was going to open the store and also drop off that furniture with the college student. But when the first customers, including that college student, arrived at PJ's Market, they saw the door was locked and the lights were off inside. Now, all of these customers knew Cheryl really well and they really liked her, and they knew she should have been there by that point. This was totally uncharacteristic of Cheryl to not be there on time, and so it wasn't long before these patrons began calling Cheryl at her home. But Cheryl never picked up. However, remember, this is 1988, so people didn't have cell phones, they used landlines, and so it was totally normal to periodically call someone and not have them pick up. It just meant they weren't home. Now, at first, people in Port Orchard just kind of assumed that, there must be a rational explanation for why Cheryl is not at work. Maybe there was a family emergency, maybe her car didn't start, but there had to be some sort of reasonable reason for her absence. But that night, Cheryl didn't show up at Roland and his girlfriend's house to collect her daughter and son. Now, Roland didn't know that Cheryl had missed work all day that day, and so he assumed Cheryl must just be running late. But by 6:30 p.m. that night, when still Cheryl had not arrived and she hadn't called, Roland finally called Cheryl. But she didn't answer, and so Roland just left Cheryl this very upbeat message on her answering machine and then waited for her to call back. But despite how cheerful this message was that Roland left, it kind of betrayed the way he actually felt. Roland was not happy. That morning, when he had woken up and realized he had slept through the night and not done the big plan to win Cheryl back, he felt so stupid. He had this chance to win her back, and he blew it. But over the next couple of hours, when Cheryl did not return Roland's call, he went from being solely worried about, how he blew this opportunity to win his ex-wife back, to now just being concerned about his ex-wife. Where is she? What's going on? And so late that night, Roland would actually call the police and report Cheryl missing. A deputy came out to Roland's house to take down this report, and then Roland actually gave the deputy a spare key to Cheryl's place, and then this deputy went to Cheryl's house. It was totally quiet. He knocked, there was no answer. He let himself inside using this spare key, and he found the home was totally in order. There was no sign of any disturbance whatsoever. The deputy eventually walked over to Cheryl's answering machine, and he saw there was a blinking light, which meant there were messages that had not been played yet. And so he hit play, and the first message was from Cheryl's daughter, who was calling to say goodnight and I love you. And then there were several messages from customers from PJ's Market that were calling to ask, why Cheryl was not at work and was she okay. There was a message from Cheryl's boss also asking, what's going on? Why aren't you at work? And then there was that message from Roland, who had called when she had not come to pick up the kids. And then the last message on the machine played, and when the deputy heard it, he knew something was terribly wrong. The last message was from a stranger who was calling Cheryl to be like, hey, I found your purse floating in Lake Union, which is near Seattle. And the stranger was like, I don't know if your purse was stolen and dumped here, or if you were here and you left it in the water or something, but I'd love to give the purse back to you. And the stranger left a phone number for Cheryl to call so she could come and pick up her purse. Lake Union was only about an hour away from Port Orchard, where Cheryl lived, but there was just no real reason she would ever be around Lake Union. She never went on trips. She didn't have the time or money to, even for short ones, like going to Lake Union an hour away. And then also, Cheryl's entire life was in Port Orchard, and her life was her kids, her jobs, and the church. And so there was just no logical explanation for why Cheryl's purse would be in Lake Union. But regardless, detectives from Port Orchard, along with police from Seattle, linked up and went out to Lake Union and began looking for Cheryl's car, because maybe she did go out here, maybe she did lose her purse in the water, and maybe she's still here. But Lake Union is a very busy place with lots of people and businesses living right along the water's edge, and even more people living right on the water in houseboats. And so there were literally thousands and thousands of cars all over Lake Union, so trying to find Cheryl's nondescript silver sedan took some time. But on the night of October 19th, so 3 days after Cheryl had failed to show up at PJ's Market for that 7 a.m. opening, police would find her car near Lake Union. And at first, it seemed like, Cheryl must have just driven here and abandoned the car for some reason, because there was no sign of a struggle inside or outside of the car. There was nothing strange about this car. It was just parked in a lot. But when authorities went around to the back of the car and used a screwdriver to pop open the trunk, they realized right away that that could not have been what happened, because Cheryl was in the trunk, and she was deceased and very clearly had been beaten to death. The investigation into Cheryl's murder would take more than a decade. The police started with Roland because 1, he was Cheryl's ex-husband, and 2, because Roland had previously been convicted for his role in a murder, even though the details of exactly what he did were never really clear. But Roland had an alibi that was airtight. He had witnesses that could confirm he was nowhere near Lake Union or Cheryl on the night that she was killed. And Roland was very cooperative with police after finding out what happened to his ex-wife. He was really bent out of shape. And so Roland very quickly signed paperwork to allow detectives to come into his home and search it and search all of his things. And he also began regularly contacting the police to offer up any information he could think of that could be useful, including an odd story he told about this young man that was following Cheryl around in the few days before she died. He didn't know much about it, but he knew there was something odd happening with this young man. Now, Roland didn't really have much more information than this suggestion that somebody was following her around, and so police were never really able to fully follow up on that lead. But police did interview virtually everybody in Cheryl's life, from her friends to her family to her coworkers at the Ford dealership and PJ's Market. They talked to people at church who knew her, and nobody really popped up as being very suspicious. Basically, everyone said, look, Cheryl was this incredible person who everybody seemed to love. It makes no sense that somebody would want to harm her. But a year after Cheryl's death, the police would get their first big break in this case. A newspaper journalist contacted the police to let them know that this random young man had contacted him and confessed to killing Cheryl and then hung up without giving his name or his location or how to get in touch with him again. It was almost like this person had called just to get this huge secret off their chest somewhat anonymously. The police convinced the journalist to actually write a story about this strange call he got to see if maybe they could flush out this young man who had just confessed. And when this article ran in the newspaper, one of Cheryl's old coworkers from the car dealership called the police to be like, hey, there was this young man who worked at this dealership with us and with Cheryl who was totally creepy and definitely had a thing for Cheryl. The coworker said this guy's name was Albie Brotsweller and that he worked in the garage and he was known as a kind of odd guy with a short temper who totally creeped out all the women who worked at the dealership. And this coworker would tell police that before Cheryl died, she had been working with Albie on his resume. And while they had been working together, Albie had developed this weird fixation on Cheryl. And when police began looking into Albie, they discovered he had quit his job at the dealership a day before Cheryl went missing, and then a couple of days after he had quit, so by this point Cheryl has been found murdered, one of Cheryl's colleagues said they saw Albie, and he had this really deep cut on his hand that he kept wrapped in a big bandage. Detectives would also discover that Albie's father lived right near PJ's Market, and Albie's mother lived right near the area where Cheryl's car had been found, out near Lake Union. And so suddenly, Roland's previously odd-seeming story about some random young man following Cheryl around before she was murdered made a lot of sense. It seemed like Albie was this strange young man Roland was talking about. When detectives tracked Albie down, he was sullen and totally uncooperative. But eventually, the police got him to talk, and he would tell them that he had cut his hand fishing. And so police rounded up all these people Albie said he had been fishing with when he cut his hand, and in separate interviews, all of those people confirmed that Albie was telling the truth. And also police knew that even though circumstantially Albie looked really suspicious, there was not a single shred of actual evidence that tied him to Cheryl's death. And so pretty quickly, Albie was let go, and the police at that point kind of hit a dead end in this case. And in fact, the case went totally cold at this point. And then, one day in 2002, so 14 years after Cheryl was murdered, a man in prison got word out to police that he actually knew exactly who killed Cheryl. He said the murderer's name was Frederick J. McKee, and that he was currently incarcerated for cooking meth. Now, we don't know exactly how this inmate knew Frederick was the killer, but this inmate who called police was cellmates with Frederick McKee, and so very likely he overheard Frederick say something incriminating, and so this inmate called the police. And so police got a DNA sample from McKee, and they compared his sample to the skin cells that were found on the duct tape that had been used to bind Cheryl's hands when she was killed, and unbelievably, it was a match. Frederick was the killer. But as police dug deeper, they quickly realized that, Frederick's heinous actions of actually killing Cheryl was not the worst part of the story. The story of what really happened to Cheryl Petre was so insanely nonsensical that right away newspapers all over the country began to cover it, it was converted into a true crime documentary, and even a famous author wrote a book about it. I mean, this story really was just totally sensational. First, I'm going to give you the facts of what happened to Cheryl. And then I'm going to give you the absurd and tragic explanation for why these things happened to Cheryl. Late on the night of October 15th, 1988, so the night that Cheryl disappeared, the meth cook, Frederick J. McKee, ambushed Cheryl as she came home from PJ's Market. We don't know exactly where the ambush happened, but we think it happened right outside of Cheryl's home. And after he ambushed her, he forced her into her own trunk, he bound her hands, and then began savagely beating her. Now, based on her injuries, Cheryl obviously put up a big fight, kicking and punching and trying her best to get out of the trunk, but eventually Frederick had taken the actual metal of the trunk and began slamming it down on Cheryl's face, and that allowed him to overpower her and eventually beat her to death. And then after she was dead, he shut the trunk with Cheryl inside of her car, and then he drove her car all the way out to Lake Union, and then he abandoned the car with Cheryl still inside of it and chucked her purse into the water. But this terrible night was not supposed to go this way. Here's what was going on in the background. At the same time that Cheryl was closing up shop at PJ's Market and beginning her trip back home, her ex-husband, Roland, on the other side of town, was sitting in his house anxiously checking his watch, waiting for the right time to launch this big plan that was going to win Cheryl back. Roland's big plan was that he was going to save Cheryl's life. He had hired his buddy, Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, who he had met in prison, and he had given Frederick a spare key to Cheryl's house. McKee was instructed by Roland to sneak into Cheryl's place before 11 p.m., so before she came home from work, and then when she got home, McKee was supposed to jump out and ambush her and tie her up and abduct her. Roland had actually gone with McKee to a hardware store to purchase the rope and duct tape that McKee would use to tie Cheryl up. But when McKee actually got to the point in the plan where he was physically removing Cheryl from her home to go take her who knows where, that was when Roland was going to jump in and save the day. And Roland had really thought about how this moment was going to go. He was going to kick the front door in and jump inside and scream at McKee, "You can't do this!" and then attack him with his judo skills until McKee ran off scared, at which point Roland would cut Cheryl free and she would grab onto him and say, "Oh my goodness, you saved me, I love you, I need you." And then after this, Roland believed they would get back together and they would live happily ever after. However, on the night of October 15th, at 11:30, when Roland looked at his watch and saw it was time to go save his ex-wife, he stood up so quickly from the couch because he was so excited to go do this thing that he had one of his low blood pressure episodes and he fainted. And then when he came to a little while later, instead of going out the door to really at this point stopping this abduction from happening, Roland just kind of trudged upstairs and went to sleep. And this was a really big problem because Frederick J. McKee, the meth cook, he was hired to actually abduct Cheryl. He was not aware that this was actually a setup for Roland to come in and save the day. McKee literally believed Roland wanted him to abduct his wife. And he didn't ask any questions. He just said, "Okay, I'll do that." And then when Roland didn't show up, Frederick went through with the actual abduction of Cheryl, and during this abduction, things got out of hand, and Frederick wound up beating Cheryl to death. Both Roland and McKee would be convicted for the murder of Cheryl Petrie. And by the time the cops had finally solved this cold case, Roland was actually already in prison for attempting to kidnap the son of another ex-wife in an effort to impress this ex-wife. It had not worked. Roland was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison, which was on top of the 25 years he was already serving, and McKee would get 20 years. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. We have this, which is MrBallen Podcast, also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. To find those shows, just search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories like the one